whether you got all 10. Just to summarise, in case you got a bit confused with some of the bits that are generally considered to be the 10 Commandments are: you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make for yourself an idol, you shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, remember the Sabbath day, honour your father and mother, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, and you shall not covet your neighbour's house, etc. And we do need to note that this was a very old-fashioned patriarchal society, and that generally today we don't see wives as people's possessions, as they might appear in that version. So I wonder how you did with looking at those 10 Commandments. It's interesting that actually there's always one or two, I think, that suddenly go out of your head, or others that you think are in the 10 Commandments that you realise actually aren't. And we might come back to some of those. Some of the things that we remember Jesus saying, perhaps we presume are in the 10 Commandments and actually aren't. Now, obviously today, don't worry, I'm not going to start going through each of the 10 Commandments in turn, because we would still be here next week if we did that. We could do a whole sermon series. Maybe that's an idea at some point. I know J. John has written a really good course and book based on the 10 Commandments, and if you want to think more about them, it would be a good resource. But looking at the commandments as a whole, firstly it occurred to me that what God is offering us here is a framework. It's a framework for us to build our lives on. He goes on to elaborate and to talk more in the rest of the law about what it means to follow God and to care for one another. Jesus, as we said, it goes on to give us, help us to think in different ways about the commands. But the 10 Commandments offer us that framework, that basis on which to build our lives. That God gives them to us because he knows us intimately. He's our loving Father who cares for us. And just as we want to protect our children, he wants us to be protected and to live the lives that he's called us to. And he gives us this framework to work from. And as I thought about them as a whole, it occurred to me that there are two ways that we could actually divide up the different, there's probably more, but the two ways that I spotted that you could divide up all the different 10 Commandments. Firstly, there are those that talk about our relationship with God, and there are those that talk about our relationship with other people. So there's, and it tends to be the big early ones are the ones that talk to us about our relationship with God, which might make us think, well, that's the first thing we need to get right in our life. That's our priority, is our relationship with God. And then there are those that are about how we interact and how we care for others. And that then reminds us that Jesus actually summarized the whole of the law in just 2 commandments. He said, well, actually, you could boil them down into 2 things. Firstly, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your strength, your mind. And then secondly, love your neighbour as yourself. Jesus said, if you follow those 2 principles, you will keep all the law. That if you love God and you love your neighbour, then you will put into practice the law. And if we think about it, that makes sense, doesn't it? If you love your children, you know that you're not going to hurt them. You don't need a law that tells you that it's not right to hurt your children, because you love them and care for them, and therefore you wouldn't do it. So they might think, well, that makes it a bit easier for us to think of it in terms of loving and loving each other. But actually, I think in a way it makes it harder, because it makes it clearer what is the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter. So I might, for example, think, well, I don't go breaking into anyone's houses and stealing things, so that's okay. I'm not breaking that commandment. But maybe if I think about loving my neighbour, loving the world globally, maybe actually I'm using more of the world's resources than is really my share. And that means that I'm then taking them from someone else. So actually, if I think about it in terms of loving those around me, loving the worldwide neighbour, actually maybe there are things in my life where I'm not keeping that law. So actually, in a way, makes it harder, I think. It helps us that it should come from our spirit and our relationship with God, but actually it makes us recognise what the spirit is rather than the letter. Likewise, I was thinking about, I don't have a shrine in the corner of my room with a little statue of a god. In a little Londis store up the road, the Hindu owners of the shop have their little shrine in the corner where they make their prayers. I haven't got one of those in my living room, so perhaps I'm doing okay on that one. Then I thought, well, what is in the corner of my living room? My TV. How much time do I spend looking at my TV compared to how much time I spend in prayer and Bible reading? And actually thought, that's a bit of a challenge for me. Maybe that becomes an idol. So if we think about what it really means to love God and really means to love each other, that will help us to recognise how we need to live our lives and to put into practice this framework that God's given us. And then secondly, I thought you could also divide up, which builds on that point, you could also divide these up into those that tell you the things that you shouldn't do, which are probably the ones that, I don't know, maybe they're the ones that came to mind first, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. We think of there's the do nots, and then there's also the do's. So there's the do nots and the do's. Now, a little bit of theology. You could, that when we break those do's and do nots, get the right word, get the language right, we talk about sins of commission. So that's where we do things, we commit things that we're not supposed to. So that's a sin of commission. But then there are also sins of omission, when we omit something, when we don't do something that we should do. And in many ways, I think those are the harder commandments to keep, because they're never ending, aren't they? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. Jesus told us to love our enemies, to love your neighbour. Those things are never ending. We can't just say, oh yeah, that's okay, I don't do that. God calls us to love, God calls us to do things. Honour your mother and father. What does that mean for us? I know that's a big one in our society today, and I know I go through a week and I suddenly think, oh, I've been so busy, I've forgotten to phone my parents. That's just simply making a phone call, and I failed to do that. So those things where we are told to do something actually are harder sometimes to put into practice. And when we look at our lives and think of things that way, we realise how short we do fall of all these things, of how easily we become so angry with someone we would wish that we would hurt them. How easily we want other things that other people have, that we see things on the adverts or in people's lives and wish that we had them. If we actually look at our spirit and we think about how we commit sin and about how we also omit doing things and sin in that way, we recognise how much we need to ask God's forgiveness. And we've been thinking over these last weeks, and I was here 2 weeks ago talking about how we could admit that we are sinners, that we do not keep God's law perfectly, and that he will forgive us. But what I didn't say then, because we didn't have time, and I wanted to remember today, is that doesn't give us then an excuse to say, well, it doesn't matter what I do or don't do then, because God's just going to forgive me. God calls us to live a life following him, a life that seeks to put into practice the principles of life that he's given us, that it calls us to build his kingdom on the framework of the laws and rules that he's given us, because he knows what is best for our life. He knows how we can best live lives that don't hurt others. And today, Martha and Neil are going to witness to their decision that they first of all recognise that they are sinners, that they need to ask God his forgiveness, and we celebrate God's giving of his forgiveness, of his welcoming them in their act of baptism. But they also are committing themselves to living that life, to following God's will for their life, for living a life that cares for others, that puts God first. And we are here to pray and support them in that way of life. And today as well, perhaps we are reminded to recommit ourselves to following that way of life, to see the things in our lives where we feel perhaps God is speaking to you today as we've read those 10 commandments about something that you need to change in your life. Perhaps he's speaking to you today, and we can all turn back to God, ask his forgiveness and start again, and then seek through the power of his Spirit to live out that way of life. Now I'm just going to give you a little last thought to think about, something to take away and think about this week, is that these are 10 commandments that God gave us. They were the 10 commandments that the people of God needed at that time. To say he's elaborated on the law and Jesus expounded on the law. I wonder if you were given the option of adding an 11th commandment, if there were such a thing, you were given that option. Someone pointed out at Bissam that it would have to be 2 really, because 11 is not a very biblical number. You'd have to have 12. But so if you were able to add 1 or 2 extra commandments, I wonder what that would be. What do you think is something that is so important for our society, our world at the moment, that maybe you would want to add as an extra commandment? Has anyone got any thoughts now that they'd like to share on that? Oh, you're all being very shy today. I tell you, well, take it home and think about it. Perhaps that's something to discuss around your dinner table, to discuss with people around you about what would be an important message to hear, for people to hear about how we live our lives today. So we're reminded by the God's commandments that he calls us to live a life that follows him. He calls us to follow that life, and we make mistakes and we don't keep up to it, but we can ask God for forgiveness, and then we seek to live that life again through his power and through his strength. And we're going to witness to that in the baptism and reaffirmation of baptism we're going to do in a minute. So what I'm going to do now is to hand back over to Jill, who's going to do a song. I'm going to go and do a quick change act because I've got to be ready to get in the pool. And when I come back, we're going to hear from Neil and Martha. Are both of you going to share something? Neil, where's Martha gone? Is she? Yeah, okay, so we're going to hear something from them about why they're doing what they're doing today. So I'll hand over to Jill.